Can you believe that this watercolor flower piece has been created using only 2 watercolor paints? Keep watching this video as I guide you through the process of painting this watercolor flower piece, and I'm also going to tell you which colors I used. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Let's start painting together. I really think that painting with a limited color palette is really fun because you can really focus on the shape of the flowers and leaves you're creating and on the beautiful color blends of the colors that you decide to mix. In this composition, I started to create the first shape of a flower with my round brush in size 12 and just a little bit of clean water. When I am quite happy with the shape of the first flower, I added to the water a little bit of Payne's Grey. So yes, Payne's Grey is the first color that I'm using in this flower composition. I allow this grey paint, this is from my Mary, to really blend into the water, and I then start to create with a little bit of water other flower shapes all around the first one that I've created. And while the shape of the second flower is also ready, I started to add this pink color. This color is Brilliant Opera Rose from Schminke Horadam. This color is very bright and I've decided to create this flower composition picking this grey color, this Payne's Grey, together with this Brilliant Opera Rose because they are contrasting colors, super bright, and I really like how they match together, how they sit together next to each other, and I also love how these colors blend if you mix them on the paper. The aim of this tutorial is really to have fun and play with these two colors. If you have them available, this is great. If you have other and similar colors to these two, please go ahead and use the colors that you have available on your color palette. For this whole tutorial, beside just using two colors, we are going to practice how to create these simple shapes of flowers and how to create simple leaves. In my case, as I said, I'm using a round brush in size 12, but if you prefer, you can use any other brush that you have available. When I create these simple flowers, what I keep in mind is what is the center of these flowers, and so I make sure that all of the petals are leading towards the same center. I like to keep the center of these flowers empty so you can see the white paper underneath. And then I also like to add a very high concentrated amount either of grey or pink paint to the center in order to allow these colors to really pop. In this whole composition, I will play a lot with mixing these two colors and allowing them to enhance each other. So for example, I've created a pink flower in the bottom part of the page and I've then added a very concentrated amount of grey into the center, and so this pink color and the dark grey color are really enhancing each other on this flower. Now I'm creating a very concentrated type of flower using a very high concentration of Payne's Grey. This means that on my brush there is a little amount of water and a very high amount of paint. In this whole composition, play with the techniques, play with wet on wet, especially in this phase, and create different elements, these can be flowers or leaves, with different concentrations of pigment. The very first flowers we have created, and also leaves that we have created, are quite high in amount of water and there is a little percentage of pigment onto the brush. This is easily understandable because if you look at the very first flowers we have created, these show the paper underneath and the amount of pigment is not very concentrated. But then for the last leaves that I've created and also for the grey flower in the bottom part of the page, I've used different percentages of pigment. I've used more pigment and less water, and so for this whole composition we are going to play with different color values for these colors. So we are going to mix different percentages of colors, so of pigments, but also different amounts of water to create all the different elements. This is a great exercise for beginners, for people that just started to play with watercolor, because you can really get to know your paints, and also you can practice with how much water you need to use on your paintings to obtain different effects. For example, in this case, I'm playing with creating leaves with a very low amount of pigment. There is just a tiny bit of pink. Then I'm adding more concentrated grey, Payne's grey, and I'm creating leaves that are much darker, and I'm also allowing this Payne grey to blend with the light pink I've created the leaf with. While we are creating the first layer for all of these flowers and leaves, you can start with, in general, lighter color values. But remember to add here and there a few brush strokes of very concentrated, either pink or grey or both colors, because it's nice with this type of compositions to have some areas where there are these contrasting colors that really highlight some elements in the composition. If you love painting flowers in these styles and you are a beginner, remember that you can always download for free the Beginner's Guide to Watercolor Flower Painting, my ebook that I wrote for all of the beginners out there that would like to improve their techniques and skills in watercolor flower painting. You can download this ebook by subscribing to my newsletter, clicking on the link in the description down below. The way I'm approaching this composition is to directly mix onto the paper the two colors. So for example, I will start creating a few petals in pink, and then I will add onto the paper, while the pink is still wet, some grey paint to allow these two colors to blend. So my approach in this sense is not to blend the two colors onto my color palette, but allow them to mix onto the paper. I really like this technique because it allows me to not control, let's say, how pink and grey are blending together, but it is a nice play and effect that I will notice once I will touch with the tip of my brush the paper that I have in front of me. Of course, you can also play differently, and you can mix onto your color palette the pink and the grey and create colored mixtures that you like to play creating flowers and leaves for your flower composition. In general, when I play with this type of compositions where I use a limited color palette, I usually like to start creating the first layer for the whole composition in a quite light color. It means that I'm using a little bit more water and a lower concentration of pigment to create the shapes of my flowers and leaves. And while I keep painting, I like to add then more contrasting brush strokes, in this case both in grey color and in pink color, to start to add areas that are much darker, where the color value is much darker. In general, when I paint flower compositions, I always like to add towards the end of my painting some brushstrokes that are much darker, because these brushstrokes are contrasting brushstrokes that will allow me to create some areas that really pop from the composition. And so this is what I am starting doing at this moment, where I am adding a few brushstrokes in the sense of leaves and flowers, maybe highlighting the center of the flowers, where these brushstrokes are more concentrated compared to the initial brushstrokes that I've used to create the flowers and the leaves. This means that for these brush strokes, as I said already, I'm using, for the same amount of water, a higher concentration either of grey or pink. And at this point I've created the first layer for all of the flowers and the leaves, and I've decided then to change my brush into a finer one, a smaller brush. This is my round one from Silver Black Velvet in size 6. And with this small brush I start to add a few brush strokes as layers, mainly through the wet on dry technique. This means that I'm adding a few brush strokes as contrasting brush strokes onto the petals and onto the leaves of this flower composition, using this fine brush and mainly using the tip of this brush. I load it with a lot of pigment and with a very dark color value, with a very concentrated color value of either gray or pink. I start to define better the shape of the leaves, or I start to add the center to the flowers. I really like to add brush strokes to highlight the shape of the petals, and in this case I'm also adding the center of this pink flower in the dark, very concentrated Payne's gray color. To create the center, I am just using the fine tip of this brush and not so much pressure. I'm creating fine lines that start from the center, and then I create a few little dots on top of these fine lines to highlight the fluffy center of these flowers. You can use the same type of color to create the center of these flowers. It means that if you have created a gray flower, you can still use the same color in a very concentrated way to create the center. Or I also created the center using the contrasting color. For example, if I created a pink flower, I decided then to use the Payne's gray color to highlight the center. This is up to you, and you can play with the color values to create contrasting brush strokes and give life to this beautiful watercolor painting. Play with details, play with how many brush strokes you want to add through the wet on dry technique, and most importantly, have fun and discover how many color values you can create just using different percentages of paints on your brushes and different amounts of water to create different effects. I hope this type of video is a type of inspiration, let's say, for other watercolor paintings that you can create using a limited amount of paints. You can proceed adding this type of details, and you can create the flower composition that best suits your style. In my case, at this point, I'm quite happy with the result of this painting. I am just looking at the composition as a whole to understand where I wanted to add a few more details. This tutorial is quite different from other videos on this channel. Let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed this tutorial, if you learned something from it, and how was your experience. I'm really looking forward to reading all of your comments and take inspiration for other tutorials I can create for you. Thank you so much for watching. See you with the next tutorial.